Hey folks, if you just started playing Griftlands like me, you might be looking for some tips to help you improve your gameplay, make your runs more successful on average, and I've got some mistakes you're going to want to avoid as a beginner.
Hey buddy, watch this.
Before we get started, I'd just like to thank Clay, the developer of Griftlands, for sponsoring this video and point you down to the description where you can learn more or even check out the game now. So when it comes to beginner mistakes, there are a lot of things in deck builders and roguelites that aren't necessarily obvious and almost operate counterintuitively to what you might expect. And I've identified some of the mistakes I think beginners are most likely to make. If you avoid these, you're going to have a lot more success in your runs, making it all the way to day 5 there, and maybe even defeating the final boss, or perhaps even playing at higher prestige levels and really starting to achieve some crazy stuff in Griftlands. So starting off here with my first beginner mistake to avoid, it's to not take every card that you're offered. You hear the word deck builder and you might think, hey, I'm going to build a really big deck and I want lots of awesome cards, so I'm going to keep adding awesome cards to my deck. But because of the way the draw system works by default, in Griftlands, you're drawing 5 cards every turn, and what that means is the more cards you have in your deck, the less likely you are to hit specific sorts of things. So if you have, 2 or 3 really powerful cards that are helping you define a synergistic play style, or they have just some really high power level spike, or there's some reward you earned, you're going to be less likely to draw those power spike cards if you have a bunch of filler stuff in your deck. So a lot of players will have a tendency to just grab everything. Ooh, goodies, rewards, extra stuff, I want it all. But it's okay to turn down card rewards for both battle and negotiation style decks. There's a button that says, hey, I'm going to take 10 shills instead of taking a card. And if you do that 4 or 5 times throughout the course of a run, those shills start to add up. You might be able to buy something more helpful, more important, get that extra graft that you might have been missing out on otherwise, when the extra cards really wouldn't have done much. And that way you can really help refine your deck as well, where you just want a few very powerful things that you're more likely and consistent to hit. Remember, you're not running out of cards in Griftlands. Anything you play is moving to the discard pile. When your draw pile is empty, the discard pile moves back into your draw pile. So there's no such thing where you're going to fatigue yourself or run out of cards. So you don't need any more than 5, for instance, would be kind of perfect because you'd always draw the exact perfect 5-card hand. Of course, 5 is pretty unrealistic to achieve, but you don't want 100, you want 20, 25 instead. It's going to work out much, much better for you. So moving on to my next tip here, it's that you should balance your run across battles and across negotiations. For instance, my very first run as Sal, I chose to do a lot of battling and not much negotiating, and that had a really high price to pay because I got to be known as a bit of a murderer, super aggressive, and that really limited our options on future runs. Not to mention, we didn't have a very good negotiation deck, so anytime I tried to enter into a negotiation deck, there wasn't really much I could do, because keep in mind, as you play cards in Griftlands, they are upgraded, and you want those upgraded versions because they're way more powerful than the base version. So if you're never doing negotiations, you're focusing specifically on battles, you're never going to upgrade your negotiation cards. You're never going to get rewards as negotiation cards either for completing those battles successfully. So your negotiation deck starts to fall apart. It's not strong enough to really do anything significant in the late game. Then that can sometimes remove options or really limit you and focus you into something specific, and way more difficult than would otherwise be necessary. And of course, vice versa can be true as well. I completely threw away a run as Rook because I was negotiating. I got to a battle and I just couldn't really do anything. None of my cards were upgraded. I didn't have any good cards to offer. So I just completely died and the run was over. That's why you need to move back and forth. The game even subtly rewards this as well, where you can get resolve restored. Your negotiation health pool regains health as you win battles. So you win a fight, your resolve goes up. It helps you maintain that back and forth balance pretty naturally and encourage you to do exactly that. So don't limit yourself only one direction in Griftlands. That's going to be a really, really punishing mistake. Moving on to my next tip here, it's that you shouldn't take any unnecessary damage. And this is one I definitely fall victim to a lot. What I mean by this, imagine you're in a battle in Griftlands and you have a couple cards that are giving you defense in hand, and your opponent is going to hit you for, say, like 8 damage. And you could play a couple cards that each give you 4 defense, and that would completely negate that 8 damage. You might say, well, I'm not going to do that because I can do more damage to my opponent this turn. I can hit them for 5 and hit them for 5, and I'll just take a hit for 4 instead of taking a hit for 8, and that'll be cool. But keep in mind that if your deck is good, your opponent is weak, often you could just play those defense cards, wait for them to take like a buff turn, or a turn where they're hitting you for less, or maybe hitting another character that's an ally of yours that doesn't really matter in the long term. And you could then use your damage in those rounds and protect yourself during the rounds you're taking damage. And saving that 4 health may not seem like much, but it starts to stack up over the course of a day, where it's like, man, if I take 4 extra here, 6 extra here, 8 extra here, you're going to be looking at a significantly lower health pool than you might want moving into the later stages of a day where you're, say, going to face a boss. So really play through your turns very carefully and look and say, hey, wait a minute, I can save some health now and just, use my damage cards later, finish off this opponent next turn without really losing much in regards to efficiency. Of course, you don't want to risk it, if you've got a scary proposition or there's some stacking, scaling buff they're doing, you might want to kill them now and you might get punished otherwise in the long term if you let them go for too long. But if it seems like a manageable, easy opponent, don't take chip damage for no reason. Plan your turns in a careful way that essentially means you can maximize your defensive nature while still killing your opponent without too much delay. Moving on to my 4th mistake here, it's to not be too stingy with your item cards. These are the green-looking cards in Griftlands. You often receive these as quest rewards. You can buy these from vendors. They're usually pretty powerful effects that get destroyed after a use or maybe a few. Sometimes they stick around for longer, but they're little power spike cards, basically. And I know the first time I played Griftlands, I basically ended up with a deck that was just full of item cards that I never really used. And that might sound good because they're like, oh, they're powerful cards on average, but they're non-synergistic in many cases. So if you're building like a discard deck or a bleed deck, your item cards may not really feed into that synergy particularly well, which means that you're going to draw a bunch of item cards that don't really power spike, they don't do anything significant or together, and the ability for them to scale into really big numbers or a really powerful swing turn doesn't exist because they're just kind of one-offs that do their own thing. Not to mention, if you get to the end of the game, their power levels from something on day 1 or 2 may not really hold up to like the final boss fight, for instance, and it might feel like you're getting a dead card. So don't be scared to just use item cards as you get them. There are more on the way. These are not going to be the last ones you ever get. And you might just save a little bit of health along the way, be a little bit more efficient throughout the course of a run on day 2, day 3. Use those item cards. Then you'll get more for later on, and you can start to refine your deck a little more carefully so that you don't even necessarily need as many item cards later on as well. And then moving on to my final tip here, this one's really less of a kind of strategic component as much as a psychological one, and that's to play slowly. There's no time limit in Griftlands. You can take 20 minutes on a turn if you really want to plan it out. That means you have plenty of time to read through cards, read through your opponent's effects, make sure you're doing math very carefully. I have a tendency to just start flinging cards around and just going in haphazard order, but if you calculate turns really, really carefully, and there's been a few times I've had to really buckle down and say, wait a minute, how can we solve this? How can we solve this? And I dug myself out of this just completely impossible situation, I thought, by really carefully lining up the cards in the right order, making sure I maximized actions so that I could get additional actions and play cards in a sequence that gave me the most synergistic options. If you do that, you'll be surprised how much you can actually optimize a turn. Now, you may not want to do that for every single fight in the game, for every single negotiation that might get tiresome, but for key moments, really slow down. Take your time, think about all the different options and orders in which you can play cards, how they might open up other things, perhaps drawing cards first to get more options, setting up combo pieces at the beginning of a turn instead of missing them later on in a turn. Just read really carefully, especially because there's a lot of cards to learn, a lot of kind of surprise and new keywords and effects on opposing characters that you may not have encountered before. You need to take it very carefully and very slowly. Of course, not everybody's streaming like myself, so it's a little bit more pressure when you got a lot of viewers watching, but if you're playing at home, there's no hurry, man. Just enjoy the sights and the sounds. The music, the animations are good enough anyway that you can kind of just chill out and take your time and make sure you're doing the best thing on any given turn. I think you'll be surprised how much you can actually save from a health standpoint, finding lethals a few turns earlier, and really just maximizing damage and opportunities. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for my beginner mistakes for Griftlands. A lot of these things might be counterintuitive if you haven't played a game like this one before. But if you listen to this advice, I think you'll have more successful runs on average, get a little bit farther, and really start to develop into a skilled player that's just murdering any opponent that runs across you. That said, if you've got any advice of your own for Griftlands players, whether beginners or more experienced, if you got tips, of course, want to hear them myself. I might learn something. So leave your tips and advice and tricks in the comments below. But until then, thanks much for watching. Thanks much to Clay for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description below. And until next time, game on.